Hello and welcome to this little tutorial about creating a little treehouse in Autodesk Maya. In this case, this is version 2023, but you should be able to follow this tutorial using any Maya version that is not older than 2017-16, roughly, because ever since then the UI changed and they added quite some features. So this is the latest version of Maya that you can get as a student. And you can get it for free, so that's quite optimal. So if you have never opened up Maya before, this is essentially how the interface should look like on your end. The most basic controls are just to refresh your memories. Holding down Alt on your keyboard. If you're on a Mac, you have to hold down Option. So whenever I say Alt, just use the Option key instead, and then you should be good to go. So holding down Alt and then left click can rotate the camera. So it essentially rotates around the center of the viewpoint. And if you scroll on your mouse, so using the mouse wheel, then you can zoom in. There's an alternative way to do that, the same thing, and that is holding down Alt and then right click to zoom in and out. And there's one thing you cannot do without a mouse, so I highly advise using one, and that is panning. So that means going to the side, up and down, while not really moving the angle, but more like the position of the camera that you're controlling. So that would be Alt and then middle mouse button. So that's how you pan. And this is, in most cases, quite impossible using a trackpad. So that is panning. So those are the most basic controls. And by default, we are using the workspace called General. So over here in the top right corner, you see General. You have a few others to choose from: Modeling Standard, Expert, Sculpting. The ones that we're going to be using are mostly General and UV editing, because that's one of the stages we have to go through. So with these basic controls, you are essentially ready to go. There's one more thing we have to change, unless your treehouse is a few centimeters big, which I suppose most of you don't want to end up with. So that would require us to change the working units to set that from centimeters to meters. There's an easy way to do that. It's a bit convoluted maybe, but that's something you have to get used to. And that can be said about many things when it comes to Maya, to be honest. So over here, under Windows, you click Windows and then come over to Settings, Preferences. And there's another submenu called Preferences. Click that, and then it opens up this floating window. And then over here, you see Settings. So in this Settings menu, there is working units, and we better change the linear mode from centimeters to meters now. And if you hit Save, now it's saved, and you can just zoom out. And now you know for a fact that this is no longer working in centimeters, but meters. So every single cell of this grid over here is 1 meter in all directions. So regardless of what kind of tool you're using, in most cases, you're probably going to start off with some sort of primitive. So primitives are usually just very, well, it's kind of in the name, primitive objects that give you some polygons to work with. And that's also the mode that we're working on. Poly modeling, also referred to as box modeling. So make sure that in Maya you are under the tab Modeling over here in the top left corner. If you switch this over to Rigging, then the top menu changes accordingly. So there's a few other options, and certain options will be removed. So for animation, it changes, etc. So go back to Modeling, and then you have tools like Mesh Tools over here. They appear only if you have Modeling selected. And this is where we live and work in most of the time. Over here, the next one in line, next to the top menu and all these fancy buttons here that do rendering, etc. There's this shelf over here. It's called Curves and Surfaces, and another category is called Poly Modeling. There's one for Sculpting, which we might use later, Rigging, Animation, and so on. And the one that we're probably going to be on most of the time is Poly Modeling, even though I personally rarely use these buttons any longer. There's, if I may say so, better ways to get to these tools or utilize them. So let's get a basic cube into the scene. And that is either by, you can get that to work by either clicking on this button over here. So this says Polygon Cube. It says create a polygonal cube on the grid. If you click, then you end up with a cube. And now that's an object. So if you click into the viewport, which is the entire scene here, you can marquee and select certain objects. And you also need to realize that in the outliner, which is essentially an overview of the hierarchy of all the things that are in your scene. So the moment you spawn a cube, a P cube one will spawn here. That is the mesh. The mesh is essentially just a few floating points called vertices that connect and form a shaded surface. So if you hit 4 on your keyboard, you can actually move over to the X-ray vision if you want to. If you hit 5, then you are back in shaded display or shaded view. If we would happen to have some textures on our model, then hitting 6 does that. But since we don't have that right now, it is not of use. So go back to 5, and then you were back at shaded display. So we can also rename things here. We could call this Uber Cube or something like that. The moment you do things to a primitive, then probably the name will be changed back to something else. So right now might not be the best moment to name your meshes. All right, so we can do things to this cube now because it's very basic. That's how most of the models you probably seen in games or movies very likely started off with. They were just mere cubes, and then eventually you carve more out of this. If you hit delete, you can also just get rid of it. There's other shapes like the sphere. And if I can give you a tip, don't use spheres ever, because they have the issue of having these pointy, I would call them a north pole and a south pole. If you take a look at as an analogy, the map of the Earth, it's problematic putting a texture on it because there will be distortion to kind of end up here on the top and the bottom. So spheres are also really hard to texture in that sense. But I might give you some tips on that later in case you need some sort of ball or some sphere. Don't use a sphere, there's a better way. I might as well just show that now. So you have a cube, and then if you come over to mesh and you smooth this, so over here, mesh, you smooth, and then this little pop-up opens up and you can just type in 2, then you smooth this twice. Now it's a spherical looking object, which could of course be improved. You can add more, then it looks even more spherical, but this is much easier to texture and UV unwrap, one of the steps that are necessary to texture objects. Okay, but I digress. So let's go back to the cube here. And sometimes in certain occasions, this menu pops up. In this case, it did. If it doesn't, then come over to the so-called channel box over here in the top right corner, channel box / layer editor. And whenever we spawn something, we give Maya the command to do something. It might be an input. So in this case, a cube is an input. If you click on Polycube 1 now, you have a few options, and those are the same ones as you have over here. You can quickly just click on width in this case and just move this over. Of course, demonstration effect doesn't work, but you can also just dial in a number. So now this would be 2 meters in width, because as we might remember, the grid is now per cell 1 meter in width. Same applies for height, obviously, so you can just dial in some values. Depth is, well, this. So now you have a bigger cube that is 2 meters in all directions. Subdivisions is essentially how many edges we want. So if we talk about edge loops, we can introduce more to have more geometry to work with later on. Like that, we can just dial in these values, just drag them or dial them in directly. Up to you. Same things over here. So in case this menu does not pop up, then you can just do the same thing here. You could also just select more at the same time and then hit a number and then hit enter to do that value or to take that value for all these. So over here, same for the subdivisions. If I want 50, now it's quite dense. So keep in mind, if you work on games, then you probably don't want to end up with all too many polygons. Whereas if you work for a movie, then it is less of a problem. All right, so let me dial in 14 just to have a bit less. That's a dense cube. So let's go back to 1 now. You can also hit tab to just cycle between them and hit enter now. That is fine. We want to have something that things can stand on and some sort of reference. So if I remove this by hitting delete or backspace, let's get a humanoid as a reference into our scene so we have some visual reference and some clarity for our mind that might help us in the long run. So we can get to the built-in and like content browser that Maya ships with by default by coming over to Windows and then Content Browser. And depending on what kind of version you're using, it might be a bit hidden in one of these editors. So it says General Editors, Modeling. It might be that it's hidden somewhere in here in your current version. But in the latest one, it's here, Content Browser. And then it opens up these sculpt base meshes. So over here we have examples. This is essentially a folder structure within the install folder of Maya. If you click on Modeling, open it up, and then you have sculpting base meshes. And then we have bipped, which is bipedal, so that means essentially humanoid. And then we can make this a bit bigger. And then we have a few models that you can just spawn into the scene. So in this case, I'm just going to use the humanbody.ma. Just double-click it to spawn it in your scene. Double-click, and then you can close this window. If we do that, now we see a human. So now we have an object, and of course we can also always zoom in, scrolling, or Alt and right-click, in and out, and up and down. However, we can also essentially just click on it. So then we enter object mode, and then if we hit not 4, but F on our keyboard, we are focusing. So regardless of where you are in your scene, you might be really offset with your camera, and you can just select the model and then hit F on your keyboard. So that's really handy, especially if you have multiple objects. So you want to focus on this thing, or on this thing, just select it, hit F. All right. So this humanoid is a bit in the way, and this cube as well. So let's get rid of the cube for now. And then if we want to move this person over to a different place, the only thing we really have to do now is use the move tool. So hitting W on your keyboard, that will spawn the gizmo. So now we have control over the axis. So over here, if you have a closer look, you have different colors, and you also have these tiny little handles on the side here. If you have a look at the axis and how they're called, the red one, as implied by the little gizmo in the bottom left, is X, so the X-axis. And this one over here is the Z-axis or Z-axis, and this is Y. So you can just click and move things up and down. You can also undo things by hitting Control Z or Z. And you can, of course, also move things sideways in any direction you want. If you click onto the center here, you can just move things around freely, but I would never advise doing that because you might think that you're moving the character into the distance, but you're just moving it somewhere in space. So that feature is a bit tricky to get used to and also really hard for the human brain to make sense of in 3D. So if you want to, for instance, as an example, want to move over this character only on two axes, in this case, for instance, X and Z at the same time, you just click on the handle over here. So now if you click it and hold it, you see now we are only controlling these two axes and it can never go up and down because the Y-axis is not affected. Same for these two. Now it will never move on the X-axis. And this one. So this is quite handy. If you only want to move him, this person over here, do that. All right, so let me get that mannequin back to the center here. If we have a closer look at the channel box over here, this is also where we can dial in values. So for instance, if we want this to be offset on the Y-axis by 1 meter, just do that. Just dial it in, or everything by 1 meter. So if you're like coming from Blender or 3ds Max, you are probably used to dial in values directly. That is possible. I personally don't do this anymore, at least not that often. Sometimes it's necessary, especially if you work with very precise things like stacking boxes and that kind of stuff. All right, so another few shortcuts that might be of use and in fact quite handy are X. So if you hold on X on your keyboard, you notice that this little gizmo in the center here turns into a circular icon. So click X, and then you can just snap to the grid. So if you just keep pressing it and then move, it will just snap to the grid. So these intersections will be used as their reference for where it's supposed to be snapping to. So then you just let go. And you can also, of course, only do that on a certain axis. So now I'm only affecting the X-axis and Z. And of course, even though we don't see a grid on the Y-axis, it is still there. So if you snap it, now it's also moving by 1 meter, 2, 3, 4, etc. So that's really useful, not only for moving objects as a whole, but also making certain vertices on your model snap to a certain thing, to a certain point of the grid. So for now, I'm just going to move this to the side so we have a bit of space. All right. There's going to be more shortcuts later when it is useful. There's way more. For instance, changing the pivot point and snapping components to other components. So W is moving, right? So you can move things, and X is snapping. And if you hit E on your keyboard now, so you will soon realize that there's this horizontal line on your keyboard that is shortcuts for all these most common things you want to be using. So W is the move tool, Q is just select tool or getting out of a certain tool. It's almost like an escape button sometimes. And then there's E, which is rotation. So with E, you can just simply rotate things on a certain axis like that. Like that. Or if you just click into the void somewhere between axes, you can just move and rotate things freely. You will also realize that the rotation over here changes accordingly. If you just set this all to 0, then it's back at where it used to be. So that's snapping. One tip, if you want to snap, I think that's what it's called. If you hold on J on your keyboard, you can make things snap in increments of, by default, set to 15 degrees. So hold down J on your keyboard, and then you can move things. And as indicated over here, you will see that it's moving by 15 degrees. So that might be helpful because now you reach perfect 90 degrees or 180, etc. So that is useful, works on all axes. J as a shortcut for incremental snapping. All right, so hit F to focus back on the mannequin. And then there's another one. If you hit R on your keyboard, you can scale things up and down, either in one direction, excuse me, up and down this direction to get an interesting kind of shape going, or 2 axes at the same time. So never forget these handles, they're super useful. Play with this to get a feel for it, but your brain will probably soon adapt, and then it is actually quite easy to make sense of this. All right, so W, moving, E, rotation, R, scaling things. So one other thing that you need to realize in 3D is that everything revolves around the so-called pivot or pivot point. In this case, this over here. So if you want to rotate, it will rotate around that point in space, the pivot. Sometimes you have a pivot somewhere else, and then you would rotate the thing around that pivot, which hopefully makes sense, but sometimes you don't want it to be over here because it might have happened by accident, or it was your decision, but now you need it to be back in the center of the model, in this case the mannequin. You can simply come over to Modify over here in the top menu and hit Center Pivot. So that's one of the beautiful things about Maya. Everything is sorted by category. So it says transform. So all these features affect transforming things. It says pivot here. So these two are for the pivot. So if you hit center pivot in this case, it's just going to be centered now. And now it would revolve and rotate around the middle point of that mannequin, so to speak. If we want to change the pivot, the position, excuse me, you would hit D, or you just hold it for the time being and let go, up to you. And then you can move the pivot anywhere you want it to be, where you need it. And then now if you, for instance, hit E to rotate, you can just do that. So that's quite useful, hitting D to realign the pivot point. You can also now that we hit D, we can hit X or keep it pressed, and then we can make the pivot snap to the grid. So now we can snap it back to the center here. These are the quintessential things you kind of need to know, otherwise your life in Maya is going to be more painful than it has to be. So D for pivot, X for snapping, and back. Right, so that's the pivot. We're going to change that quite often throughout the creation of a treehouse, as it is very essential to realign things and move vertices and faces and edges, all these different components. All right, so let me get this person, or the equivalent of what a person could be in the realms of 3D, out of the way. Now let's get started with creating some sort of plane, so we have something that the tree itself can stand on. And we can get a simple plane by just clicking on the polygon plane over here. If I do that, it spawns a plane. So hit F to focus. And then we come over to the inputs over here. So over here, click it. And then we have some basic control over the width, height subdivisions. So if we just make this bigger, let's say 10. So since we're working in meters, it would be 10 meters. That's a decent basis, I'd say. You can also play with the subdivisions if you want this to be rather simplified. So just one polygon instead of, well, you do the math. You just select this, hit 1, and now it's back to only one polygon. So right now the grid is a bit in the way. You can always come over to this button over here. So this line is essentially a few shortcuts to create certain effects, render effects, but also the grid itself. So click it, now it's gone. So now we have some visual reference. And this is enough for now to just have some baseline plane underneath our tree. If you want the grid back, just hit that button here. Okay, cool. What else is important? I think for now this is okay. So how do we start with a tree? That is a good question, because there's no clear winner when it comes to the workflow or the approach. But there's certain workflows that probably stood the test of time, so to speak. And one of which is create a cylinder. So if you come over here, the polygon cylinder, click it, and now you end up with this thing. I can, of course, move it up a bit. So this is the basis for our tree, or it can be. You could also do this based on a cube, but again, please do not use a sphere. That is usually a bit problematic. Oh, excuse me, misclicked. Okay, so the polycylinder, if you click it, you can change these subdivisions over here. The polycylinder 1 input. So now if you set this to 1, it becomes like this this shape that could be used as a roof later on if you want to. So 3 is actually the minimum. And then you can just click and drag and increase the number. So one very important thing to realize in box modeling or anything related to 3D is that you better work with even numbers, because later on, if you work with numbers such as 19, if you look at it, you cannot divide this. So the math doesn't check out. It's just going to be much harder for you to mirror things or to use any kind of symmetry. So please use even values and avoid uneven values. All right, so 20 it is, or something like that. It really doesn't matter as long as it's even. So 22 would be fine, 12 would be fine, 13 wouldn't be. So you have a total amount of 15K, if I'm not mistaken, for the assignment, which would mean that we have to be careful with how many polygons we introduce for everything. So we have a limit, so we have to be a bit mindful about it at least. So maybe, I don't know, 16 could work. That looks good, because in all directions we have a clear divide between these different sections of our cylinder. Okay, cool. So now, if we don't need this plane right now, we can simply just hit H. So you select this thing, hit H. Now it's hidden. It's not gone. If you look at your outliner over here, it is essentially grayed out, which means it's still existent. So that would be our ground. Just renamed it. If we want to get it back, we have to click on it and hit H again. Now it's back. And this is the tree. So again, we can name this. Maybe it might not be the best time right now, but up to you. And now, if I click on the inputs, we can still make some changes. So maybe I want to have a different amount of caps. So if you click on it and then just drag, you can have more subdivisions on the inside so that we can mold this into something else. For this particular model, I don't need it, but you know now that it's a feature. So let me get rid of this plane here, hit H. And now, if I click and zoom in, I want to select the bottom here. So all these polygons. With the tools you already know by now, that is not possible. So we have to switch over to a so-called component mode. So if you right-click and you keep it pressed, you can now switch between different component modes. The most common ones are the object mode. That's the one we've been using until now. It's essentially just selecting entire models. And then you have multi-mode, which is essentially a mode that lets you go through all the modes that there are all at once, depending on where you hover over. There's face mode, which is also called polygon mode. You are essentially selecting triangles or quads. And then there's, of course, the vertex mode, which will enable you to select the dots in space, referred to as vertices. And now, of course, you have the control, right? You have like the control we already know by now, which is the move tool. We can just move these vertices. Same for the faces. We can rotate things. And we can, of course, scale things down or up. And also squash things that way. So this is how you get all the fancy looking geometry and shapes in 3D. So up to us what we want to be using for most of the time. It's always context sensitive. So whatever you do, there's probably a good component mode. I cannot really tell you when to use a certain mode exactly, but in this case, for the bottom, I'm going to move over to the face mode. So now if I want to select them, I can just essentially click and drag. Now they are selected. Now you see they're highlighted. The issue with this mode, though, is that it will also essentially select the back faces here. So that's not optimal, because if I want to get rid of it and I hit delete or backspace now, it will also get rid of everything else that got selected by accident. If I undo this, there's a better mode for this kind of task, and that would be holding down Tab. So instead of the Marquee tool for selecting objects and meshes, you hold down Tab and just paint your selection that way. So that's selected and nothing else. Now we can hit backspace or delete, get rid of this. Why are we doing this? Because in game development especially, you don't want to have any geometry or any polygons that are unnecessary. In this case, it is unnecessary because it's going to be a tree that's going to stand on the ground. And why would you want any polygons to be rendered by a game engine later on, as an example, if you will never see them? So the less or the fewer polygons you use or have, the less the CPU has to work. So if you work on a game, you probably want to end up with at least 30 FPS or 60 FPS, so the frames per second. And you cannot just bombard your CPU and your GPU, your graphics card processing unit, with unnecessary data. So work in a mindful way and optimize your models. If you don't see it, and you will never see things, if it's, for instance, a house and you have polygons for the bottom, which no one will ever see, get rid of them. That's the mantra you should be following for anything related to game dev. All right, so I can also just switch over to vertex mode here and then move things up and down. I'm pretty happy with the width. So this is a rather big tree, but that's not a problem. So where's our pivot? It is somewhat in the center, a bit offset. Now the issue is if I want to scale everything down, we'll scale from that pivot. And now we have a hovering basis for a tree. If I undo, I want to reset my pivot point to be on the bottom here, because the pivot point also defines from where we are scaling things up and down. So I want to put the pivot into the center here. So I hold down D for changing the pivot, and then X. And then just click on the Y axis handle here, the gizmo it's called. And then you just click and drag down until it fits, and then you just let go of everything. Now it's here, and if I now scale this, hitting R on my keyboard, you can just scale it like that. Now it would also rotate around that axis, which is probably more realistic in that sense. So find something that visually makes sense, because there's no real rules. It's all about eyeballing and getting a feel for these organic kind of shapes. Okay, so also maybe a bit taller like that. If we scale this down now, we can also make this a bit more narrow, so you have more like a pyramid kind of structure. With organic models like a tree, you want to use the least amount of polygons you can use to convey the shape. So that means it's all about the silhouette. There is a quick and dirty way to check silhouettes in your scene, because by default, Maya does not use any lights. The viewport is lit so that we are able to see anything in the first place, but the scene itself actually does not have any lights, because otherwise it would pop up on your outliner here. If you click on this tiny little button over here, it says use all lights over here. And then it uses all the lights, but since there's no lights, it will just become black. This is a pretty good and decent, quick, dirty trick, so to speak, to check the silhouette of objects. So, I mean, this humanoid checks out as a humanoid, because from a distance you are able to tell that this is humanoid. Well, this is not a tree yet, but keep this in mind as a trick to quickly check, because if the silhouette is readable as such, then you're doing a good job. So if it looks like, I don't know, tentacle arms, then you probably have a weird tree going on. Okay, so let's keep going here. We're just getting started. We want more topology. We want more detail so that we can add more detail to this. Detail as in subdivisions. So a subdivision is just an edge loop. It will follow through based on what it has in the scene right now, or on the mesh, to be more precise. So there's certain tools to get us more subdivisions. You can, of course, come back to polycylinder and then do changes here. So you could say, okay, I want more subdivisions. And then this might happen. So it's completely broken. The reason for that is that you did other things, or in this case, I did other things in the meantime. I tweaked it, I deleted a component. So this is the so-called history in Maya. Whatever you do, things are stacked on top of each other. And at some point you have a billion things you did. And then you go back to one of these inputs and you want to make a change, and Maya cannot really compute. So then you get broken and completely glitched out objects. Sometimes you just need to delete the history in order to get rid of all this piled up, sorry for my French, crap that you build up over time. So you click on the model, excuse me, and then you come over to edit on top here, and then you choose delete by type and history. There's a shortcut, Alt, Shift, and D, or on a Mac it would be Option, Shift, D. Now the history is gone, and the model is now less cursed. Now you also got rid of all the options, but as they are not really working anyway, after you've did a few things to a model, nothing big is lost. Okay, so let's move over to some tools we can use to shape this into something new. Most of the tools, the incredible tools you need, are under Mesh Tools here. You can just click one of these. For instance, one of the most commonly used ones is called Multicut or Insert Edge Loop tool. There's other tools that you might want to use, for instance, the sculpting tools to get a better tree shape. So it's a bit of like a trickery going on to ease up or to ease the pain when it comes to a better workflow. And you can also undock all these menus. Whenever you see these two dotted lines, you can just click, and now it's a floating window. So if you need these tools more often, just dock them to the side. Up to you. So there's also Edit Mesh. This has like bevel, bridge, connecting vertices or components. So this is for all the component modes like edge, face, and vertex mode. And certain ones like those are only for vertices, edges, and faces. So then it depends on what mode you are in. If you're in face mode, then those would work. For instance, poke, just an example. Poke creates a vertex in the center of your faces. Now we have this thing that you can drag out. Odd demonstration, but now you know it's a thing. Okay. So let's go back here and come over to Mesh Tools and then use the Multicut tool. Now you have a way to insert vertices. So you could now, for instance, just click and drag. So now it follows this edge. And then you let go, and you can click more. This way you can introduce geometry and be creative and click and rotate and so on and so forth, and eventually end up at the same spot to where you started. Then you just click it, and then you hit enter to confirm, and now you have this interesting looking edge. You also have an n-gon over here, which is a problem. So, excuse me, do not do this. You could now double click the edge, and it does not really find the edge loop, so then you know something is broken. Usually Maya is really good at finding the edge loop, so it finds all of this for you if you just double click it. But over here, because we have an n-gon, it's just broken off, just like it cannot compute. Oh look, there's another one over here. So if we switch to vertex mode. So whenever there's a polygon that has more than 4 vertices, it becomes an n-gon. And that is to be avoided, like the plague. So let me undo this. The multi-cut tool has to be used well, because it can also destroy not only your mind, but also your final grade very easily. So come over to Mesh Tools again, and then Multi-Cut Tool. And then if you hold down Control, now you can insert these so-called edge loops. There's also a dedicated Insert Edge Loop tool, which does the same thing. So that can be handy. But I personally prefer the multi-cut tool because it does more than just one thing. So hold on Control, and then you can just decide where you want things to be. So just click to introduce an edge loop, maybe over here, maybe here, maybe here, there, maybe a bit more dense on the bottom here, because we also want roots to be coming out of the tree. So maybe one over here, here, here. All right, so if you want to leave this tool, right now you will always see where the tool is. It's always over here. If you double click it, it will open up the tool settings. So the tool settings are always changing depending on what kind of tool you're using, obviously. And you can dock this tool settings window to anywhere. All the floating windows in Maya can be docked. You can just hover over a corner and then let go. Once it turns blue, it knows that it can now dock, and if you let go, now it's part of that UI over here. You can also click on the tool settings in this case and just let go, and then you undock this and dock it somewhere else. Sometimes this is a bit finicky, and then you just let go. There it is. So I'm going to be using this more often, so I'm just going to keep it here. So now that essentially made our viewport smaller, so I'm just going to right-click the outline in this case and say Close Tab. So over here, Outliner, Close Tab. Now we have a bit more real estate. All right. So if you want to leave this tool, as I mentioned earlier, hit Q. So Q is just the selection tool or select tool. It's actually not meant to exit tools, but I think everyone uses it as such. So it's the tool that ends all the other tools. Now you exited, so to speak, the tool that we just used. So let's come over to this section over here, and let's introduce some roots. So if we select this face, hold down Shift, these 4 or these 6. Again, the faster way is to just hold down Tab, and then we can just paint our selection. And now we're going to use a feature called Extrude, which is one of the most commonly used ones. So whenever you do hard surface modeling, for instance, cars or props that are rather, consist mainly out of hard angled edges, then you probably want to extrude a lot in order to get that shape going, and that can get you really far. So extrusion is a tool that you will be using a lot for most models, including a tree. So the way to extrude is essentially come over to the Move tool by hitting W, and then you can hold down Shift, hovering over a gizmo in any or off any direction. And the moment you hold down Shift, it will tell you Extrude, and now you can essentially just drag more geometry out of it. So hold down, and you can also do that in any direction. So 2 directions at the same point, 2 axes. And that can be done endlessly. And then more and more. So holding down Shift is one of these shortcuts that might be of use. If I undo all of this, that was just a quick demonstration. We are going to extrude this. So if you want to extrude this in a certain direction, because right now we can only extrude this into this or up. If you want this to, the gizmo to follow the direction of the average of all of these selections, which would be like in the center and then pointing towards us right now, based on this angle towards us, so to the bottom, then we have to hold down W and then left click. And then we can switch between object or world space. And sometimes that does not do anything. So then we have to come over to component mode, because that's based on what component mode you are using. So that's the faces and that's the component mode. So that will align the pivot into our direction. So if I now shift click, we can move this in that direction. There's other ways to extrude, and that would be Control E. And then you get that little floaty window here. And this has a few controls. So the same thing, you can change the thickness or the local translate. So please do avoid these kinds of things. So do not push polygons into itself, so to speak. And then the offset, you can make this bigger and smaller. You can also add divisions that way if you need more geometry. You can also say like, okay, do not keep them together so they all get separated and they follow their own direction. That can be interesting. So let me undo this. There's another way to do extrusion, and that would be come over to, or becoming over to edit mesh and then extrude. And you can just drag using the handles. So there's a billion ways to do one thing in Maya. That's why the entire UI is very cluttered. It's not because it's all unique features. It's usually most of them are just repeated, and you find all these things on different spots. So once you see through all the, like this charade, so to speak, you realize that Maya is actually not that complex. It's just repetition everywhere. Okay, so the thing is with roots, if you look at reference, then that's not how roots look like. So what I want now is to select these 4. And again, dragging, selecting will also select the backside here. So please hold down Tab and do the selection that way. And now we want to use a tool called Circularize. It's a tough word. And quite honestly, I don't even know where exactly to find it in the menu. So I'm going to be using another way of accessing all the menus that you have at your disposal at all times. So this is what most people call the context menu mode or expert mode. So just a quick example here is to come over to Modeling Expert in the top right corner. You can switch over to Workspace Modeling Expert, and then you're essentially left with only the viewport and only the most rudimentary features. So that's how I usually work, not because I like to feel good about myself, feeling like an expert because it tells me to, or that I am an expert, but because it just unclutters everything. And everything you need is essentially always there. You just need to know the shortcut. And for all of these things, that's always Shift and right click. So Shift, right click gives you this menu that gives you all the possibilities you could possibly ask for at that very moment in time. So even if you do not have anything selected, you have a cube. You can just Shift, right click and say, oh, I want a cube. And then based on the component mode, if you, for instance, now select this one, hit F, zoom in a bit, Shift, right click gives you all the things that you probably want at that moment. So you never have to become a menu dweller ever again, because everything you could possibly need and want at that moment is there. You don't even have to, well, dwell in any submenus. It's all here. Shift, right click right now. Let me bevel this thing. Super quick and dirty. Not even dirty, just quick. Extrude face. then extrude face again. There. Just a quick demonstration. So these menus are always here, and that's how I usually work. It's actually hard for me to go back to the old-fashioned way, but as beginners it's probably a bit easier to understand. That's why I'm doing this. So over here, if you have this selection now, if you want to circularize, such a hard word to pronounce for me, you would shift right click, and then over here in this contextual menu that again shows you all the options you could possibly do right now that would make sense, you find triangulate, so that makes things into triangles. You find quadrangulate if you have tris but you want them to become quads, so four-sided polygons. And you also have circularize. So I do that, it gives me this shape that is circular, and you can play with the twist a bit to get it maybe back to like more like how you want it. This can essentially be the basis for a root, because now we have this roundish object and we did not introduce any n-gons because everything is still quads. So again, as mentioned earlier, do not have any n-gons. That will disqualify you very quickly from this attempt of creating a treehouse. So now we can essentially just extrude this. So if I now, for instance, hit Control E, or I come over to Edit Mesh and Extrude, or simply Shift right click and say Extrude Face, just simply drag this out, we are starting to have something that looks somewhat rooty, if that's a word. It is now. And then if you hit R for scaling things up and down, you can just make this smaller here, and then we drag this out a bit further and down. And I remember we used to have this plane on the bottom because we want to have a plane in our final result that kind of intersects with the branches, or in this case, the roots. So the way to get the outliner back, to make things that were hidden or became hidden, to unhide them, we need to get the outliner back so that I can select it and then hit H to unhide it, as mentioned earlier. So there's a few ways to get that. Most of the windows that you probably want to access are under Windows. So if you click Windows, you find all of these things. The tool settings, script editors if you want to script, and also the outliner. So it's over here, or even easier, over here. So it says show or hide the outliner over here. If you click it, there it is. So the thing that I called the ground earlier is still here, it's just invisible. So if you unhide this, hitting H, we got it back. Now we can actually come back in here and then maybe change it to vertex mode, and then select these few and then just intersect them somehow by dragging them down. And over here, I mean, it's not the most convincing looking branch or root. So we probably need more geometry to bend this a bit. So whenever you work with organic looking models, then give it the appropriate amount of edge flows or edge loops to make it more believable. That's what it comes down to in anything 3D. It has to be believable, not necessarily realistic, because none of the things that you do in the beginning especially look very realistic. It's very common to use stylized things and try to get close to realistic or realism for that matter. All right, so the multicut tool lives here, as we learned earlier. And then you can just hold down Control in order to introduce more geometry. Just click, let go. And the further away it gets from the bark, or not the bark, but what is it called? The trunk or the tree itself, we want fewer of those edge loops. So just less evenly distributed, a bit like larger spaces in between, a bigger distance. So if you double click now on this edge, we can still maybe make this a little bit bigger, maybe this one slightly bigger, this one, just double click, oops, zoom in, double click a bit. You might not even have to change this at all. If I hit 4 on my keyboard now, we are back to the X-ray vision that can help you just quickly making sense of things and selecting things that are otherwise hidden. If you hit 5 again, 4 and 5 are your friends from now on. So just lower this down even further and then hit 5 to go back to shaded view. Now, of course, this is not the end of it. We can also come back to vertex mode and just move things sideways a bit. So right now, the gizmo is a bit screwed. So that would imply that we probably want to change this and realign this. So realigning the pivot, I showed you earlier that if you use the move tool currently, you can just hold down W for the move tool, and then left click, and then you can change this to world mode. So that helps a bit, or object mode. Sometimes they line up, so object and world mode are the same. Sometimes they're not. And if it doesn't work out, you can also switch over to component mode. And that is also still a problem. So then what we alternatively can do as well is hold down D for the pivot point. Just click on any of these directions, either an edge or a different component mode like face or vertex mode. Just click, and now the pivot point's aligned to the average distance from all these vertices, so essentially the center. In this case, probably I want the edge here, so click. And now we have something that kind of follows the direction that I want to move this into. Just move this. So D is also not just for realigning the pivot like on a certain axis, but also aligning it to any component you want to. So just click anywhere you want it to, and then your current selection will move from where your pivot point is now. Can be helpful. Just hold down, click, make your selection like that. And maybe if I select, if I select those now, is the pivot fine? Hell no. You just click here. Now it's better, more appropriate. Sometimes it is really beyond saving. The pivot point is just doing whatever it wants. Then the easiest thing to fix that is just coming over to the tool settings and say reset tool. Now the pivot point is essentially back to world space, and the coordinates are all 0. So now it's not acting weird any longer, hopefully. Okay, now it's back to how the pivot point usually acts. And if you now try object mode, it might even work. But of course, Maya sometimes just doesn't want me, or I'm getting something wrong. I don't know. But yeah, that's how it works. And you can, again, just double click and maybe also scale things up and down, move them like that. Maybe rotate things slightly. So now you have quite some geometry to work with and make it count. So whenever you introduce an edge loop, and if you don't not even doing anything with it, why did you introduce it in the first place? You're just cluttering your GPU and CPU with unnecessary data and geometry that has to be rendered. But if it doesn't add anything visually, then you're doing it wrong. So play around with this more. I don't need the outliner, so just either click here, close tab, or this button, get it, or leave it like that. And then you can also maybe push it up a bit more. So it's fine if these kinds of these faces and polygons are interfering or intersecting with the ground here. We can take care of that later. So right now, essentially, if this is the result we're happy with, we could also delete those faces because we can never see them in the final result. So we could just backspace and delete them. So that saves some polygons. I mean, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. If we're talking about 4 polygons, more or less, that probably doesn't really have a huge impact on anything, really. But it's good to establish this mindset of working in an optimized way. So right now, we also notice that this looks rather smooth, and the branch over here, the root, does not. It looks very blocky, almost like Minecraft kind of style. And that's just a matter of the normals. So every single face has a normal, which means the way it's pointing out or away from you, to put it in layman's terms. So every surface is only rendered from one side. So to demonstrate that is, if you, for instance, get rid of one, just delete it, you might think that there is the inside and that's being rendered. It is only being rendered because Maya gives us some black color here, or just blackness, darkness, so that we have an easier time modeling. However, if you would export this thing to a game engine, that's not how game engines render 3D models. What they do, or what the engine would do, it would not render the inside right now. It would be invisible. You would still see it from this side, but not from this one. So in order to kind of simulate that situation, you can come over to shading in your viewport settings here. Shading, and then if you turn on backface culling, it will cull the backfaces. Culling means do not render. So it does not render the backfaces. So enable this, and then you see through it. Now it is invisible, as if there's nothing. You can just see through things. I know this is weird, but you have to realize that all of this is math and software, and it does not necessarily think the way humans think. It's tech. So these are the things you have to get used to as a 3D artist or 3D designer, 3D engineer, however you want to call yourself. So this is what the engine will do, regardless of whether you want this or not. So you would have to fix the hole. Or there's another way to maybe play with the normals a bit. Because right now, all of these surfaces are facing us. Therefore, we're seeing these surfaces, these flat shaded surfaces. If we, for instance, want everything to be rendered the other way around, so to speak, you can just select everything, come over to Mesh Display and say, hey, please do reverse the normals. If I do that, now everything is rendered, but essentially all the other surfaces on the inside. So now we have a hollow tree, and the game engine will also render this way. So if you have, let me quickly demonstrate that on a cube. It's just a classic example. So you have a house, right? Okay, I mean, this is the most basic form of a house that can be. But if you would reverse the normals, now you have a hollow box, which means this could be the basis for an interior for a game, as an example. So it's all about the normals. They're only facing one direction. I mean, if you ask yourself, why would this thing be rendered on both sides? It just adds double the amount of computation power that has to be taken care of by your CPU and your GPU. So why? In most games, you do not look inside characters. That's why I now see like the outside, because I can just see through from this direction. If I want to get like an eerie experience, I can just reverse this now, and then I have the human on the inside, which is a really weird 3D effect. But yeah, I hope you kind of get the idea. And of course, you can not only do that for an entire object, but if I reverse this one now back to how it used to be, you can also just select this one and now reverse this one alone. Now we can see through. But from the inside, we would only see that one thing. Of course, it's a really bad demonstration, but if you would now go in and then look on into the opposite direction, you would see essentially just one face hovering in space while the rest is transparent or invisible. So I'm going to reverse this, and now I deleted this polygon over here, which we have to fill. So we would have to click on this edge, double click, and finds the rest. And there's a feature called fill hole. So just click it, and then you fill the hole. There we go. All right, so those are a few things you can do to the normals, and it might be of use, but we are still left with an issue now. And the issue is that these surfaces, these flat surfaces, are rendered differently based on their normals. One of the things you have to keep in mind in Maya is that normals can be rendered differently, and the normals, the direction that they're facing can be averaged or be essentially hardened, which means it's pointing out exactly towards the camera, so to speak. So in order to fix these issues, because you realize that these two faces here, this one and this one in particular, but also the entire root over here, looks slightly different, right? This has like this, again, like this Minecraft kind of look. That might be desired, but it might not be. If you want everything to look kind of Minecrafty, I suppose, select everything, just come over to Mesh Display, and then if you go a bit further down, so we used the reverse to reverse things, but there's also harden edge, soften edge, and then soften/harden edges. So that's up to you how you want to decide what kind of edge or like direction your normals are supposed to be facing. So if we change everything to harden edge, now everything is essentially being rendered as is. So this renders every single polygon the way it actually is being done, and everything is essentially flat. So that can be the desired look, but it doesn't have to be. But this could be like your low poly tree. Over here we have some shading issues, like it doesn't look as pleasing as it could be. So up to you. Sometimes it's desired, sometimes it's not. And if you want everything to look more smooth, it can actually essentially average all the normals on every edge for you, and then it appears to look more smooth than it actually is. So that's a nice way of tricking the human eye to thinking that this is more smooth than it actually is. So if we do that, mesh display, and then hit soften edge, and if you now look at it, it looks smooth like the butt of a baby. So that's much better now. So there was another thing. If you come over to mesh display and we choose soften/harden edge, there's this tiny little box, and you realize that this is appearing almost everywhere. This implies that there's a few more options you can choose from. So if you click on this tiny little options box, it opens up the menu of that feature, and that can sometimes, or actually in all cases, gives you more options to change how this feature works and what it does exactly. So if we change this from 30, we could just use that for now, just hit apply. So there's a difference. If you hit soft hard, then it will just do that, and it will close the window as well. But if you only hit apply, then it will not remove that window, it will stay open, and you can test things. So for instance, say like I want an angle of, so this is 30. If I want an angle of 45 degrees for the averaging of the normals, hit apply. Looks slightly different. That kind of fixed the branches now to a certain extent, right? At some point, it's like, well, it can only do this much. You need more geometry to actually get a more smooth representation. So we have to introduce more edge loops in order to get this to look smoother. Or we bump this up to, I don't know, 90. Let's see what happens. Now it's super smooth, even though there's little to no geometry. If you overdo this, you see like now it's trying to average this little geometry it has. And this polygon is not even flat. It's like bent in weird ways. As you can see from this angle. So then you get these weird shading issues. There's a way to fix this by clicking it and then saying mesh triangulate. So then you have two triangles, which is fine. Right? Triangles is not a problem, and quads is not a problem because the game engine will make quads out of everything anyway. So if you model in quads, it's very handy for you as a modeler. And the game engine, once you export this or import this into the game engine, it would do this for you without you even realizing it. It will just triangulate everything because that's the only way a game engine can render meshes. But it's not very handy for us to model this way because then you have so many triangles and it's really hard to do extrusion and that kind of stuff. So just so you know how game engines function, it will triangulate. So that's unavoidable, so to speak. So if we set this back to 30 and then just soft art, and now it's back to how it used to be. You can also make a selection, like you can also just tell this surface to only soften or harden this selection. Up to you. So soften. So you can be artistic and say like this is supposed to be super hard and the rest is super smooth, and then you get this, might I say, abomination. So what I usually do is like find a sweet spot, like soften edge everything, and then if there's more geometry needed, then you just introduce more. So shift right click again is like the shortcut to most of the tools you can probably use or need right now, or over here the not so cool way, I suppose. So multi-cut, maybe more here, and then maybe, oops, in edge mode, just a bit less, maybe a bit further down. Maybe make this a bit more bloaty, so to speak. So this is like the art side of things. It's just eyeballing and getting a feel for what is realistic. And of course, the artists know this, that there's no life without any reference, right? You cannot exist as an artist without reference. Our memories are usually flawed, and we might think we know exactly how a tree looks like, but our memories usually kind of trick us into thinking that we know more than we do. So have reference next to you, refresh your brain, your memory, your eyes constantly, because only then you know whether you are actually achieving anything of worth. So this can all be tweaked using the sculpting tools later on, because we can soften everything a bit and maybe give it, inflate it a bit and bulge it a bit more. So we're going to do that later. So for now, this is fine. One branch is probably not enough for a tree. It still looks a bit odd. So what I'm going to be doing is like find another angle and then do a selection over here. So these 4 faces, not 5, but 4. And then we're going to do the same thing, shift right click, and then we circularize. Man, that's such a hard word. The circle thing. We're just going to call it the circle thing from now on. Find something that looks fine. Like just eyeball this. There's no values or stats you are supposed to use at all times, or like presets that always work. It's all just context sensitive and based on what you are currently doing. So Control E in this case, just a different shortcut. You could have also just used Shift and then dragged it out to extrude. Smaller, move it maybe in a bit like this direction, then rotate it a bit. This is all just, can I get away with this or not? That's the question you're gonna ask yourself. Multi-cut, then hold down Control. A few more towards the main chunk of the tree. One more here, and then you in edge mode you just play around with it a bit. And again, if this is supposed to be moving into the right, onto the right side now, left side, excuse me, obviously, we can eyeball this like that, but of course we just learned that we can also align the pivot point. So hold down D and click, and now it's facing that direction. D, just realign the pivot point. And again, don't forget to sometimes just reset the tool, because Maya being weird, that will happen. And of course, over here, let me move all of this here. So at some point you become this person who's just going to be like selecting, moving, and you might think, or might at least hope, that there's a somewhat more efficient way. And obviously, whenever you ask yourself that question, someone else out there before your time probably already had the same thought. Like, there's got to be a better way. And that is why we have Maya 2023 in this case, and we're not still working with Maya 1.0 from back in the days. Things get better. There's tools, one of which is called the soft selection tool. And this is a godsend feature. So over here in your tool settings, you can also see this thing in action, or activate it that way. It says soft selection. If you click it, you can just activate that thing. And now you get certain colors. You can play with the fall off radius, so how much you want to be, or want this to affect. So it goes from 0 to all the way to 100, and you can even extend that range. There's a shortcut for that. So what this thing does is it affects more than just the currently selected vertices. So whatever is yellow is being affected by your movement, in this case, by 100%. And then over time it turns into red, and then black essentially, and then eventually it fizzles out or fades out, and everything that is not black is not being affected at all. So this means 100%, roughly, I don't know, 50, 25, 10 maybe, or even less, and then nothing. So this is like soft selection with which you can quickly move things around, and also works in all different tools like movement, rotation, and scaling things. So of course this is tedious doing it this way, always coming over here and then enabling it. So I've seen students doing this by accident, hitting B on the keyboard, and then everything is weird. So B is the shortcut for enabling the soft select mode, or soft selection. The thing is, like, you can quickly expand your selection right now by just holding down B and then left clicking. So B is enable, disable, but also hold B and then click, left click, and then drag it to the side. This way we will affect more or less. So if I, for instance, come over here and then move this, it will only affect these a bit. So, but if I expand my selection, you do this. And if you overdo it, you affect the entire tree as well. Then you're like, ooh, maybe too much. There's always a too much You're just gonna get some experience and find that value that becomes too much based on a gut feeling in most cases. So I love soft selection. B is your friend. Whenever it's organic, select something, hit B, and then hold down B to expand or lower the threshold here. And then you can move things. So rotate them, twist them in this case. Or scale things up and down. So that is a weird tree. Please do not ship this. Soft selection. It's awesome for organic stuff, and I'd say that a root qualifies as organic material. So maybe over here we can improve this further by rotating this and then moving this here, maybe even further, and then maybe also soft selection. And eventually you have something that, oops, not on this axis, you have something that you're happy with, and then you clap your hands, and then you are happy. So this is a lot of going back and forth, and you don't have to be too pedantic about it. Don't spend a billion years to perfect every single vertex or vertice, the vertices. Also, don't forget to set this to soften edge just to get a feel for it. Like, is this fine from distance? Yeah, starting to look like, I don't really know what it looks like, but maybe one more will do the trick. So same thing over here. We select a few. And then we do the circle thing, the Circularize components trick. Shift right click and then Circularize components. Man, I hate that word. And then you twist this to an extent so that it makes sense visually. You can also do this, but then you introduce issues because there will be overlap of polygons and vertices, and it's just going to introduce some shading issues. So play with this until you're somewhat happy, and then you will extrude from there. Control E, or shift dragging it out, or edit mesh, extrude, all the same. So the multi-cut tool. This is hopefully starting to get us into the realms of trees, or at least that our brain could possibly think that this could be a tree. Again, it's all about believability to a certain extent. And it's regardless of what kind of industry you're working in or what kind of project, whether this is for movies, animation, or for games. Believability is key. Most consumers will just see a thing and they accept it, or they don't. They won't spend too much time analyzing things and then decide whether they like it. Usually happens within a few split seconds. It's either good enough or it is not even in the ballpark of being at least somewhat believable. Okay, so this one can be smaller without soft selection. So hit F to focus on things. And maybe a bit further up. This is way too small. There. Good enough. Maybe a bit more geometry here. Not sure about that. Soft select. Hold down B. Move things. Yeah, kinda. So this almost looks like some sort of, I don't know if you guys know Baba Yaga, like Russian fairy tales, folklore. This could be like a chicken leg that your house is going to be standing on. Well, not like that, but maybe like that. Perfection. Okay, let me get rid of this. Mesh display, soften edge, and now everything is more smooth. And maybe, just maybe, because we are, after all, perfectionists, maybe a branch that's coming from this direction. So do the circular thing, twist it, maybe make it a bit smaller, move it over here. Now we're experiencing quite some issues here. We can fix that later. And then extrude, and then just get this thing out of here. Push it. Don't push it too far, as you usually do. Like that. Multi-cut. It's all the same. Once you kind of get the hang of it, it probably will work out. B, soft selection. Is that realistic? More or less. Again, reference. You need reference. Otherwise, you're just going to think you're doing fine. You might not do fine. Looks believable enough. It's your job to convince us that you have a bit more often, you're more artistically inclined. Let's put it that way. All right, so those are the roots. And this is okay for now. Let me turn off the grid here. It's a bit convoluted. If you want everything to render a bit more nicely in the viewport, just a quick tip. Over here, you have this tiny little button called screen space ambient occlusion. So ambient occlusion is an effect that essentially occludes lighting from spaces where the ambient light cannot reach those very spaces. So in other words, you get shadows for objects that are close by, or like that are essentially touching each other, so to speak. So if you do that, then everything that is close to another surface gets this shading effect. It's a very cheap trick, nowadays at least, to get some better looking renders. And this is also a trick that is used in game dev a lot as a post-processing effect. And over here, there's also motion blur. Could be interesting for 3D animation in Maya. And also multi-sampling anti-aliasing, which means you might see all these weird jagged edges here, and this is just going to make this more smooth. So now everything is a bit more smooth. So if you want to share anything to your fellow peers, have a screenshot, do not forget to turn these buttons on, because they make everything a bit more grounded looking. Things look less floaty and less, well, janky, if you will. Just a quick tip. This also has a major impact on performance. So if you have lots of objects in your scene and you do this, then you might feel it. Everything becomes a bit slow. All right. Oops, misclicked. Did I change the rendering of the viewport? No, I did not. Okay. So the same thing we did to these roots, we would do to the branches. So probably in order to have this circular effect, we need to introduce a bit more geometry here. Hit B to turn off the soft select mode, or on. And then maybe a branch over here. Hold down tab. And then you do the Circularize. Please forgive me for my English sins. Extrude. And you might want to drag this up a bit, not all too much. Multi-cut. So this is a way to make a tree. There's only God knows, or any God knows, how many ways there can possibly be. This is a way that makes sense to me. If you find better ways, be my guest, do it. Don't tell me you're using Blender and that is the solution just because it's free. That's not how anything works in life. Blender is awesome, by the way, but it is not more or less awesome than Maya. If you still insist, do that. Okay, getting closer to a decent result here. That is a branch. Looks a bit boring, maybe. We can spice it up by moving this a bit further down and lowering this and putting this more up, so it has a certain character to it almost. that's a branch. So you would keep doing this for forever until you're kind of happy. So since this is a tree house, I'd say that I don't know how much percentage or how many percentages it would require to make this into a believable thing. But I'd say 50% of the experience of looking at a tree house is the tree. So you might as well spend some time on this to make this somewhat convincing. So more branches is more. So maybe this also might be a good time to introduce the Insert Edge Loop tool, which is a different multi-cut tool. It's right underneath here. And again, you also find these things here, the Mesh Tools submenu. Again, these two dotted lines, you can click them, and then you have this floaty window. So whenever you click on a tool, it tells you what to do. And also over here, you have a few options. Like the most commonly used ones for the Insert Edge Loop tool are called relative distance from edge. This is essentially just multi-cut like that. Or you tell it to introduce multiple edge loops all at once. And you can define how many you want. It can be all the way up to 50. So you just click once and then you get 50. Or, I don't know, 20. Or less. 10. Up to you. Gives you less precision in this case, but if you have something like, I don't know, you work on a castle and you need to have exactly a certain amount because you want these, I think they're called crenels, like these battlements where you have like these gaps where knights used to peek through when they used their bows and arrows on intruders. Then these kinds of things might be quite valuable as a tool. It all depends. The insert edge loop. There was another thing that we could do. There's equal distance from edge, but this is a tool that I rarely use. So experiment with this, and usually the multi-cut is awesome because, again, you can paint things with this, and then confirmed hitting enter. Be mindful about it because it's the easiest way to create n-gons, something you do not want. So there's an n-gon, there's an n-gon. Bad, really bad. But also this feature, and it also goes this way. All directions. It is pretty awesome. So multi-cut all the way. So let's say you also want more, like 2 more here. Just a quick demo to also get edge loops in a different way. There's one other way. If you hold down Control, right click, and then there's a few options here. You can grow selections or shrink selections. Works for faces, whatever you want. So face, and then you Control right click, say grow, and we'll just grow the thing. And shrink is obviously the other way around. So up to you. But in this contextual menu, you also find, if you click on an edge, Control, and then you've got edge ring utilities over here. So over here, and then you have to edge ring it and split. If you do that, it's going to split the edge. And this is also a way to get edge rings around something. So you click on an edge, and then you do the thing. Edge ring, utilities to edge ring and split. And one of the beautiful features of Maya is the G button. G repeats the last command you did. So the last thing you did, it will just do that again. And you can do that endlessly. So if you click on an edge, you hit G, just going to apply the same feature or same thing we just did. Just going to split things. Also useful if you are selecting something and you're Control right clicking this and then hit grow selection. And you hit grow. And then you hit G, and you can just expand the growth, so to speak. And of course, if you undo this, it looks like it's shrinking, but actually it's not just undoing it. But you can also shrink selection, do that once, and then hit G to repeat the last command. So shrink, 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 shrink. Very useful. Mesh display, soften. All right. that is a way. There's another way, obviously, and you're here to learn. So this is not a monkey see, monkey do tutorial where you just follow along and you pass. You're here to learn. So I'm going to show you a few other alternatives to do a thing. So you can also bevel edges. I showed this earlier on a, very quickly, earlier on a cube. So if you have a cube, just a quick demo, you can decide to, for instance, bevel this face. It is over here, edit mesh, and then bevel, or shift right click and bevel face. And it bevels it, so because there's no such thing as perfect 90-degree angles in real life, and neither should your 3D models have such thing. So always have some sort of bevel to it, so it looks a bit more convincing. So then you can also have segments like that. Chamfer is just not going to bevel it for real, but more like introducing another extrude in the center here. So be mindful about the segments. In game dev, you can sometimes get away with exactly one segment or two or three, but don't do this. Like, this is super smooth. It might look amazing, but again, games are real-time software. Do not bombard your computer or your final platform with all too much data. Be reasonable. That's the reason why all the old games look kind of shitty by comparison to nowadays, because there's a finite amount of resources you have to make things run in real time. So you can't just throw everything at your PC or a PlayStation, if that's your target platform, and then expect it to run everything. No. Optimization is important. So that is beveling. And you can also abuse beveling to get more edges. It's just a creative way of getting that. So if you double click and then you would bevel this, then it essentially just sets two of those apart, and you just introduced, well, one more, and then it pushes itself out so it finds the average in between. So here, and then if I G to do it again, bevel. So that can be creatively used to also have more or get more. But beveling also changes the normals. So now this is harden edged and the rest is still soft. So everything has to be soft. So hit that mesh display normals soften edge. And we fixed it. All right, that was a bit of a detour. But it is your house and your tree. And I don't know exactly how you're going to do this. So these are ways to apply that maybe to different situations. Maybe a bit bigger. So I'm using soft select all the time here. Maybe we should also have some branches that are coming from essentially the same branch, so that it's branching out. Maybe here, do the circular thing. Make sure that you scale this down. Now I actually lost the possibility to, I just undid this, the possibility to twist this. So let me first twist this and then hit R for scaling, and then you scale this down. Maybe move this slightly. And then from here on, you're going to extrude. And this way you get sub-branches, if that's even a word. I think it is. It might be. Okay, here. Maybe rotate this slightly. Vertex mode smaller. So soft selection is sometimes problematic because you're also essentially reaching other places that you do not want to reach at that moment. So sometimes it's a bit like you have to find a workaround. You could also now use the grow and shrink feature here. If you select those and then you control right click, say grow, and just G to repeat once more. So those vertices are too close together, so we have to kind of find a way to do this. Just accidentally also selected here, so always be mindful about the angle. Sometimes you're like selecting vertices like that, and then so much else is selected, and you do changes, and then everything else also, of course, is affected. So that can be a problem. Always look at things from different angles, just triple check. So that is kind of bad looking, so probably want to expand this a bit and then rotate it. Lower this down again. Probably up, because there's going to be some leaves, some treetops that we're going to add. Maybe over here, just one more rotation. Some point you're just going to let go and then be happy with what you've got and move on. Soften edge. Okay. It's fine. So now it's going up, both of it at the same time. And then we can add some treetops. So again, this is, you can spend all night and all day to perfect this, which we obviously are going to do. What else did you expect? And then you move this over here, maybe bevel this edge, because then it just separates this for us. So this edge, just double click it so that it finds the edge loop. If you bevel this now, then add some segments, maybe like that. You can also scale this up and down, obviously, so find some balance. And keep in mind that, as I mentioned earlier, whenever you have an edge loop, then make use of it. Otherwise, there's no reason it should exist. It doesn't always have to do like obvious things or over the top, but subtlety is also king in certain situations. So now is the good time to actually tell the pivot to do it differently, because it's still facing up the wrong direction if I want to move it following the direction of the actual branch itself, in this case. So W, left click, and then object mode. It still doesn't work. Component mode, yeah, that works. Also for here, if you want to the scaling in this case to follow the direction, hold down R for scaling, and then left click, and then component mode. So this is how you align the pivot to all these things. There might be a better way, but that's what I got used to, and it works, and it's okay. It is just okay. So that's okay. This is all fine. So if we add more treetops now to this, like actual leaves, like these blobs, then this could be a treehouse that we get away with. Problem right now is like we don't even have a branch where a house could be on. So maybe over here, one last one. Maybe make this a big one because it has to support an entire house, which I think wouldn't even be enough. So we introduce one more edge loop here. So maybe all these will be the basis for our circular and slightly twisted basis for our branch. Yep, that looks okay. And then you just extrude this like that. Make this somewhat smaller. Push it out. Make it rather big, because we can already have some sort of reference. Maybe the basis and foundation of our house can be a cube that we just scale up, and then we put it here and squash it a bit. And then push it up and then kind of align it. There's a quick way to snap things. So we had snapping to the grid, which is X. We had snapping of the pivot, which is D. And one of my favorite hotkeys of all time, of all software that I know, is V. V is snapping to components. So V means if I hold on V, it's snapping to whatever component it is touching. In most cases, it's probably going to be the vertices. So now you can make this pivot snap to the vertices of this object. So if you hold down V, and you just click, and then you can go through all the vertices that it finds and just let go. Now it quickly moved over here. Also put it on the head of the human. Theoretically. So this one goes on top of the head, holding down V there. Quickly snap, or to, I don't know, it's toenail. Just V. Just finds, if I hit 4, you see what's happening. It just finds these vertices and just snaps by holding down V. That can be used for anything, really. It's one of the most powerful, underutilized features, I suppose. If you have a cube, again, perfect demonstration, and you make this more smooth by introducing more subdivisions, just a quick demo. And let's say you have a, not a plane, but a cylinder. You want to quickly move this over here, just hold down V, and then move it to the side. And as long as they are somewhat connected, so to speak, you can move things over. So now, if you hold down V, you can make things snap to other things, and a face snap to another face by holding down V. So this is a weird demo, I know, but snapping is super powerful. Snap things to things. That's the mantra. What a sentence. Snap things to things. There we go, and then you just eyeball the rest, just rotate it slightly. Oh, maybe even too big still. Or not. So now we can also test this mannequin on top of this thing, so you don't have to click eyeball and then drag. Just hold on V to snap. It will snap to the outermost vertex. And then you can still align this. So now you know how things are in relation to everything else. So will this be enough? Maybe not. Maybe a bit further so that I can actually go like around it. So almost as if the branch is embracing the house later on. So for this, I'm going to use multi-cut again. Lots of it. And then less. Okay, there. And maybe, just maybe, I want more. So maybe just select them and extrude further. And this one is going to kind of go up, so it will embrace the plateau. Like that. And then we can still kind of smooth this out using soft select and just move things at the same time to kind of balance this a bit. So now, yeah, I don't know, maybe like this. Oh, the pivot point is all weird. Again, if that happens, hit D and then just align it with something that makes more sense. So it should not intersect all too much because it is just sitting on this plateau. Lower this down, holding down B. Moving this up, holding down D. Then you're like, okay. Just so that it looks somewhat believable, but not all too static and rigid. Let's give it a bit of like organic feel by moving things slightly. So this adds a lot. This hole alone makes it work as such. Because if this would just be super straight, I mean, these kinds of trees don't exist. Although probably you find a picture on the internet where that happened exactly one time. But always work with cliches. Whenever you see a cliche tree, it's probably a good gaming prop. All right, so same thing here, soften edge, and then you are somewhat fine with this thing. So now you even see like, oh, that's how the thing is embracing the plateau. Maybe the face, put it up a bit more. I'm still in soft selection mode. Whenever you see like this yellowish tint, you know it's soft select. And then if you do this, it does not really work because it currently has too much selected. Now it would work, but it's just weird. So hit B to leave that mode. Make it a bit bigger maybe. Then this person can also sit here, holding down V, and move it. Cool. Not my proudest achievement when it comes to trees, but it's all about you showing us that you are more artistically inclined than I am. So this is good enough for now. Might be a bit boring, so maybe give this one more. So edge ring utilities and split, an alternative way to get an edge ring. Give this tree a bit of some movement. Again, if you have the possibility to make this look more organic, then please do so. Based on the edge rings you have, don't let them go to waste. Just sit there doing nothing. Give things a random direction to make it more believable. And actually, we as humans are quite easily fooled. That's one of the best parts. Yep, that's all right. So let's use another feature called saving. I haven't been saving anything. So if this crashes now, everything is gone, which is bad. And you don't want to end up the same way I ended up many times in my career for not saving things. So come over to File and then hit Save Scene. So that's the easiest way to save things. And do not save anything on your desktop, ever. Because of demonstrational purposes, I'm going to do that. And then you would call this my masterpiece. If I can give you another tip, would be that do not save things as Maya binary, but save them as Maya ASCII. So if you save it as Maya binary, it adds like this .mb, because that's the file type, to it for you, and then you can open this up only in Maya. But if you save this as a Maya ASCII, you can also essentially open up your model or your scene with all the meshes and all the information in a text editor, because an ASCII file is just a text file. So this might save your life, because an ASCII can be opened as a text editor or within text editor, and then you essentially can fix corrupt files that cannot be opened any longer with a text editor if you are a super nerd. It helped me at least once. Up to you, probably doesn't really matter all that much, but just a tip. I'm going to save this as MA file, so Maya ASCII, save as. This is not the preferred way to save things. There's a better way. That would be File, and then you set up a project. So project window, then you would say current project, new, and you call this my treehouse or something. And then you find the location where you want to save this thing, probably in a folder called my treehouse. Again, not under your desktop, but somewhere where it makes sense. Maybe a, I don't know, cloud-based service, so you have a backup, right? And then it will create all these subfolders for you once you hit accept. So there's going to be a folder for movie files, sound stuff, clips, images, other assets, the scenes. Hit accept. And now the last stage is to save the scene as. And now you're already inside of that folder. So on the desktop, there's my treehouse, and you have scenes, and now you can save this in here, and you will always find this. Now you could also zip this entire folder, which you have to do in most cases. And then you give this to us, hand it over, and then we can see all the textures as well, if that's even a requirement, which I think it's not. But you have to upload this to Sketchfab, so that'll do. But that's the way to do it. So you have an entire project with a certain folder structure. If you just save the scene as, and then hand that over just in MA or MB file, and it already has textures that you want to display, it won't find those textures because it's still referring to your local folder on your hard disk drive, which we do not have access to. So please do not make that mistake, and trust us, we see this mistake happening every year, many times. All right, so this looks fine. It can look finer, if that's a thing you can say. You can sculpt a bit. Sculpting is not really being used now for actually sculpting, but just cleaning up and making it look a bit more organic. So in order to access sculpting tools, you can just click on sculpting. So instead of poly modeling over here, you switch over to sculpting. So the only thing that we really use is maybe the smooth tool, which is the second one line, or use the first one and then hold down shift, which is also smoothing. It's a shortcut. And there's another one we're going to use later. It's called bulge or inflate. So I'm just going to hide this for now. So click it, hit H. This one can be hidden, so click it, H. And again, if you want them back, the outliner, it's all here. You just have to hit H again, then it's back. But for now, this is all we need. So if I use the sculpting tool, if I click this first one in line here, it says lift a surface. So click it, now you are in sculpting mode. And if I reset the tool, it is using certain values like size 25, which is super big. Like the brush is bigger than 20 trees and the strength is way too much. So what we want to do is lower the size, and it's very similar to how the brush, well, the soft selection, not the brush, but the soft selection mode in hitting B works. So if you hold down Alt, excuse me, it's actually not Alt. There used to be a shortcut, was it? No. I guess I kind of forgot the shortcut. Doesn't really matter. Once we have a setting that we're happy with, so roughly the size of this, we can start sculpting things. So then you see that things are happening, they're slightly moved. And maybe you want to make this a bit less big and then change the strength. And if you hold down Shift now, we can smooth things. So smoothing is like a shortcut to smooth the average. Now you get a bit more like realistic results fairly quickly. Now the branches look a bit more believable, as if they're really like coming from that direction. So super quickly, like 5-ish, maybe up to 5 as a strength, and then size 2 in my case. Up to you, play with these values, whatever works for you visually. There's no right and wrong. So holding down Shift essentially makes this tool into the second one here, the smooth tool. So you can also directly just go there and then use that one instead. Then you don't even have to hold down Shift or anything. But yeah, that's how I do this, because sometimes I just want to sculpt a bit more. So I switched over to the sculpting tool there, and then smooth this by holding down Shift. In most cases, it looks slightly better after you did that. Just relaxing things. This thing actually decreased in quality, I'd say. Kind of depends on the branch and how it's set up. So I'm just holding down Shift and selecting these things. And then clicking. Just a bit more organic looking. You can right click and say exit sculpting, or just as usual hit Q on your keyboard to go back to the selection mode menu. That's also how you leave it and exit that tool. So maybe this needs a bit more fixing now. If I select these edges, I'm just going to do it manually using the soft selection, hitting B and just pushing this in a bit. I think this looks slightly better. Okay. And don't forget to also hit mesh display and soften. So yeah, that's okay. It's not flawless. There's still shading issues, but once we are down to texturing this thing, if you bake a normal map, which we will do eventually, yes, it's called baking. It's got nothing to do with cakes, but it's still called baking. It's rendering essentially. If we do that, then these issues are usually not visible or only slightly, so that can be okay. I'm rather happy. If you spend more time, there was a thing that I did earlier today. This is a test. My masterpiece save, yes. So this is one of the things I did earlier. Looks slightly different. If I open up like all these, just hide them, including this one. So you spend more time, you get something more organic. Just same technique. There's nothing that I did to this that couldn't have been done to the other tree. Okay, that was a quick demo of what I did earlier, and then let's go back to our version here. That's okay, but maybe add more. Well, just more. Maybe like that. Less bulky or more bulky. Maybe over here, just make everything more fat by selecting all of this. playing with the Maya's bugging out right now a bit. It doesn't let me soft select the thing. All right, vertex mode. Select all of this. Now it works. And you just essentially realign the pivot point to the bottom here, so it kind of uses the center, and then you can make everything super fat. Okay. That's all right. Maybe like that. And again, work on this for ages or don't, up to you. Back to getting our cube. So I'm going to be calling this a house, a human body. What's left for now, that would be these treetops. So make that a habit, by the way, Control S to save things. If you want to be super pedantic about being on the safer side, there's something called incremental save. So once you save your scene as such, at least once, there is increment and save over here. So whenever you hit Control Alt and S, which would be the shortcut, it's just going to add a 0001 point and then the file type to the name of your file. So from now on, whenever you do a change, and that is usually implied by this tiny little asterisk that happens right after the file name that you see in the top left corner. So an asterisk means there's a change, and now you can actually save this. But then don't hit Control S, but hit increment and save. And it's just going to up that number of the file name to 0002. So every time you do that, you can always end up with another version of this file, and you have eventually up to 9,999 backups that you can always fall back onto. That might feel like a bit like over the top or too much. But if your current version just broke, it's corrupt, which might happen. It's Maya after all. Maya is prone to crash. That might save you having a backup from back in the day so you don't have to do everything again from scratch. Trust me, it will happen. There will be students that will cry 5 minutes before the deadline asking us for mercy. No mercy. You could have saved your work. You could have had 9,999 backups. You decided to have none. All right, let's stop being snarky here. So that's a model, and we need treetops. So let's get to it. The way to do that is two ways. The classic low poly blobby way is just have a cube, and then hit mesh, smooth, and then do that twice. And then you have a blob that you just make, I don't know, more blobby. If anyone has seen Hotel Transylvania, you know what blob I'm talking about. And then you move this, and now that we know that we can hit V to snap things, you can just quickly snap this to over here. And then if I hold down E, I can just move this to component mode to change the direction of the pivot. Oh, that works better. Now I can move this like that. W, hold it down, world space, and then the pivot point is less of an issue. Once you're happy with this, which obviously doesn't look great, you could duplicate this. We're not done yet though, so come over to face mode and select one. Maybe soft selection mode, and then push things in slightly so it looks less rigid and a bit more organic maybe. Just slightly push things out, give it some life. So because treetops are not super blobby and static, they have some direction to them. So this might take ages and it might not look amazing. So holding down R to go to the pivot point mode of that current selection, maybe object or world, and then just make this a bit more big. Again, R and then object mode. Does that help? Nope. Maybe hold down D for the pivot point, put it here, and then scale it in like that. I think I made this super big. Yeah, it's organic, so it doesn't even have to be perfect. Just somewhere in space. And again, if this is getting out of hand with how the pivot point behaves, just reset it. So that is a way getting these blobby things here. And once you're happy, you can hit Control D, or while having this thing selected, you hit Edit and then Duplicate. So same thing, duplicate and then move the thing. Then you have the same one, and you can make this maybe smaller, rotate this slightly so it is not that obvious that it's the same one. It's all about faking it. Not even close. There. So, that's more like a potato. I mean, if you make this green, it probably you can get away with it. So do either this, or, well, I find there's a better way. And I'm going to show that in a second. Yeah, that's the thing. You cannot really make this super good. Soft, maybe. If you give this color, it could work. Or maybe not. And now I'm just wasting everyone's time. Cool. So not this way. It's, oops, excuse me. It's an option. How else can we do this? If you happen to play D&D, you probably know what a D20 is. If you don't, a D20 is a 20-sided die. That could be a good basis for getting this blobbiness to work. Just a trick that I stumbled upon. It looks rather cartoony, but it could work. So let's get a D20 in here. So there's no primitive that says D20, but over here you see that this thing pops up, right? It's called a platonic solid. So if you click that, it introduces, I'm just going to make this a bit bigger, this D20 looking kind of thing, a bit smaller. So over here in the inputs, if you come over here, you can change this to a tetrahedron, which is essentially a D4, if you play tabletop RPGs, a cube. So all the different dice types are here. And this is a D12, and this is a D20. And we could essentially now abuse this to make this into something else, as you would with anything in 3D. Just all about having creative thoughts and then finding a solution. So over here, I'm just going to up the subdivisions to 1. So now this looks more like almost like a sphere. And now if I come over to the face mode and make sure that you are not in soft selection mode, so B, and you select all of this, and if I now extrude this, and then I'm going to use the offset, or maybe keep faces together. I think that's also important. If we turn that off, and you play with the offset here, yeah. So now we are actually offsetting our current selection here with the extrude. And now since we have this selection going, it's really important that you have the keep faces together mode off. And then we hit R and just essentially just push all of this out. Make this a bit smaller. So now this could be the basis of the blobbiness that we are after. Kinda. So if I hit V to snap this to this person's head, we have treetop person. Or here, maybe make it bigger. So yeah, that does not look amazing. Let me do this again. A D20. That's how I would call it. That's not the name. It's an icosahedron or icosahedron. So maybe 2 subdivisions. Oh, I think that's going to be too much. 1. And then in face mode, we want to affect those and hit Control E for the extrude. Keep faces together. Nope. And then the offset. that will give us lots of billions of issues. So maybe like that. And then thickness, that also does the trick. Okay, don't overdo it with the local translate. Divisions. This could actually work. So from a distance, it's like, oh yeah, that looks rather blocky and almost believable for a low poly kind of art style. If you click this and also make this soft, this could actually work. Maybe squash it a bit, squeeze it, squash it, that kind of stuff. Okay, so V to just get this here, rotate this maybe, and then over here. And then Control D to duplicate over here. And make sure that you maybe rotate this so it's not the same, even though there's not too much visual fidelity in this thing anyway, so you wouldn't even be able to see the difference all that much. So maybe this branch actually is on the wrong spot. You have to change the direction here so that it can live on its own. And then, of course, soft select would help us a great deal right now. Yeah, and then back to the outliner to get back the thing that I just hid there. And then V to snap it. Now it is not still touching. Maybe like that. That's okay. As long as it intersects, no one will bat an eye. If I hide this, we can also, because we're talking about optimization, or at least I am, get rid of these, because we won't see them. Come back and unhide it, hitting H. Same here, just hide it. There's an alternative to hiding things. You can also just decide to only show one model instead of having to hide everything constantly. And the shortcut for it is a bit weird, but you get used to it. It's over here. It's called Show, Isolate, Select, and then View Selected. They used to tell you what shortcut it is. It is Shift 1. Or is it Shift 1? No, it's actually Control 1, excuse me. So Control 1 is isolate the selected. So everything else is now essentially not visible. Only the thing you selected and made into this isolated model. It's implied by this tiny little button here, which you can of course also click. That's a shortcut, Control 1. Whenever everything has to get out of the way, do that. Then you can focus. Okay, what else are we not going to see? We will probably see this, so let's leave it. Phase and then tab, bye-bye. If we see this, that you did these things, we're going to be grateful somehow. Might not really make a huge difference for your final grade, but it shows that you are dedicated and then that you listened and that you care about performance, because an asset is only good if it looks good and works well and meets the requirements for the target engine, and you're not just spamming the platform with unnecessary stuff. Right. Is this sticking in enough? Push it further down so it's hidden. Okay. So yeah, that's blobby. Control D to duplicate and then V to snap this here. Rotate it. Quite blobby. Rotate. Give it some life by introducing new properties. Some of them are just a bit skewed. You can also use soft selection, of course, to just make some of this go in further, and just random selections here and just move things, maybe rotate them slightly. So it feels all a bit more organic and less rigid, and it's less obvious that everything is the same. Sometimes you only have to just select one vertex and just push things in and out. Same here, vertex mode, select some, move them in, here, move them in. All these tiny little details, they go a long way because our subconscious mind picks these things up without us realizing, but that might make the difference between, oh, this looks cool, and yeah, it looks fine. It's as simple as that. Bigger, maybe, slightly. So at some point, as you probably realized, I moved the camera much faster now, because I assume that you guys also know a bit better how to deal with the viewport, the shortcuts by now. Practice makes one somewhat acceptable. Do practice a lot, and you will get better. V to snap, but after I duplicated this thing. So this is something I'm not happy with. This is not how trees work. They do not end up like that. It's probably going to be like this. But then the proportions are so off. This is like, oh, this is definitely scaled. So instead of doing it this way, you probably want to duplicate this a few times and then rotate this. Maybe slightly. To a certain extent, you can make this bigger, but don't push it too much. Subtle changes go a long way. And so yeah, you have to keep the amount of polygons in mind as well. So you cannot just introduce more and more and more just because it's cool. You have to be mindful. So there's one way to check out whether things are still like in the realms of acceptability, so to speak, if that's even a word. So that's a tree from a distance, but we don't know how much or how many polys we have or vertices. So how can we check that? Well, we can come over to display and then heads up display. And this gives us quite some options like frame rate of our current movie that we're animating in Maya, if you ever get to do that. There's also poly count. So over here, you would enable that in order to see how much stuff you've got going on. So because it might be a bit hard to read, I'm going to change the background here. So the background is, there's a shortcut, Alt and B, and you can memorize that if you have like this analogy in your mind that essentially means alternative background. So Alt B, alternative background. So if you hit that, it changes it to a more bright background. If you do that again, it goes to the classic Maya background color, which you can change. You can change this to from yellow to pink for all I care, or if that floats your boat, then do that. Or Alt B, again, in order to get like this mode that is the least straining on your eye, and this also makes it a bit more visible what's going on here. So it says verts, edges, faces, tries, and or trees. Well, not really trees, but tries. And UVs. So right now it says verts 13,344, edges 26,000 something, and so on. Which means this is like the first row over here is all the stuff that's going on in the entire scene. All the objects and models. So if you were to delete this one, it's significantly less, which is obviously a good thing because we have a limit of 15K. So the second one in line says 0, and there's a third one also saying 0. So this is the entire scene. If I have a selection, like this object, this is essentially the object mode. Like this tells us what this object has in total. Total of 542 verts, 1080 edges, faces 540, etc. And now the third one in line is essentially if you come over to some component mode, it will show you the current selection of the thing. So if you select all this, it will show you currently you've got 52 verts selected. 91. All of them. And that works in all the different modes. Face mode, for instance, tells you 2 trees or tries and 1 face. And so on. If I hold on Shift to select more. I hope that makes sense. That might help you not going beyond the poly count here. Because again, 15K is the limit. If you do like this infected treehouse, then you've got 20,000 at your disposal. but please do not go beyond that unless you have a really good reason, because you clearly know what you're doing and the art itself speaks for itself and it looks amazing. Then we can be convinced that it was worth it. Otherwise, it's just a means for us to prevent meshes that are beyond recognition because you used all the vertices there are, or there can be. So Alt B to go back to the other alternative backgrounds. If you do this quickly enough, you can have a party with your friends. If you find an intern who does that throughout the night for 7 hours straight. All right. This is the basis for a treehouse. I mean, again, I'm not super happy with this. Maybe you need more. Do not break it too much visually by introducing these things and make them too big. It becomes quite obvious very quickly. So one more thing, you can also combine meshes, obviously. You can say like this one is supposed to be part of these. Then you would essentially select them, holding down Shift, and then either do it the quick way by Shift right click and then you find Combine, or Mesh Combine. As mentioned earlier, everything you do in Maya, you can find that in other menus again and again and again. So Shift right click, it is for me, and then Combine. And now it's one model, one mesh that also shares the same UV. Not the same UVs, excuse me, the same pivot point. It will not share the same UVs unless you apply the same material to all of them. But we're going to get there later. Okay, so that is the thing now. And if I want to be a good artist / designer or engineer who's modeling, make sure that this thing is in the center of the house here. And by now we know how to do that. Hold down D and then X to... I made that weird noise, I'm sorry. It was unnecessary. So put this somewhere here in the center, where it could be the center. So D, then maybe here. Now it would also rotate and fall over like that. Cool. So one step that I want to show you, which is right now not really that necessary, but gives things a bit of color, maybe just to make this less dull looking. I by accident animated something. Let me undo that by breaking the keyframe here. Remove in between, that also got rid of it. And I think if we just say break connections, there we go. Okay, that happened by accident. Now it's also a good time to actually save, or do the increment and save, which is even better. There we go. Now it's 0004, so I have a few files to fall back onto in case something goes wrong. All right, now it's also a good time to actually delete the history, because if you look at the inputs, there's quite some stuff that we did. These are all the steps. I'm just gonna want to get rid of all this unnecessary data and information. So delete by type history, and then it's all gone. The only thing remaining now is essentially like the mesh where it is in space, the fact that it is a mesh, and the way it's rendered, and what kind of materials they are in order to render this thing in the first place, and in case you want to add textures later on. So you can see all of that information if you move over to the attribute editor over here, which is essentially the same thing as the channel box, but it is horizontal. And for some people, it's a bit easier to understand. So again, this is essentially the same thing as coming over here and telling it to move maybe by 1 meter on the x-axis. You could do the same thing in the attribute editor over here. So translate is the x, y, and z axis. So if you do this here, it's exactly the same thing. And this tells us what we've currently have, or currently having, which is the transform component, which tells us where it is, how big it is, how rotated things are. This is the mesh itself, that's the name of it. This is the shader, which tells us it's of the type Lambert, so it's not that glossy looking, but more like rough looking almost. And Lambert 1 is the material. So this is the thing we could change to make it look more, I don't know, green. So change the colors here to whatever you want. Now everything is green because they all share the same material. And materials can contain textures or colors, flat colors, transparency, normal maps, all the fancy stuff. Maybe if we first separate this, because we combined this now, if we shift right click and say separate, now it is back to its own separate meshes again. And this one, we want to make this brown because it's a tree. And by the way, this is not enough for texturing, right? This is not texturing, this is just giving the material some color. Don't confuse those two things. If we want to give this a different color, we first have to assign a new material to this. So you would have to right click this, and then over here you have assign new material. So if you let go, now it opens up this box and tells you, okay, what kind of shader do you want? Do you want this weird looking blend shader that makes everything look like plastic, or Lambert, or Fong, or PBR stuff? The standard surface, that would be the thing. We're just going to go for Lambert. Eventually, you're going to move these things over to Substance Painter or Substance 3D Painter. And in there, the shader that you use in Maya eventually does not matter at all. This is just for us to see things in Maya. Unless you want to render things in Maya, then it matters quite a lot. So Lambert it is, and now it's just this super basic looking material. So for this one, we can also move over to Lambert 1. You probably want to name this to tree_matte for material or something like that. And then if you give this a brownish color now, less saturated, then we have something that almost looks like a tree. And this also shares the same material as this. So if I change the color here, then everything else that was also assigned to this material will also change back. So undo this and assign a new material here. Lambert, and I don't know, maybe gray is fine for now. And this one also gets its own material. I'm going to call this ground, or maybe not ground 1, it's already taken by something else. Ground_matte for material. And this one is going to be brownish, but maybe a bit more beige or more green. Yeah, we have a tree and a thing that can hold a house. For instance, oops, excuse me. Oops again. Object mode. There. And then holding down V. And that thing also has its own material now. Actually shares the same thing as the treetops. So this is the house mat. All of these steps are not really necessary right now, but I'm just want to give you some colors so it looks less dull. We have to assign materials later on the moment we want to move this over to texturing, and also if we want to UV this. So UVing is the stage of translating 3D meshes into, well, essentially 2D, so that we can apply 2D textures on things, on surfaces. So I'm gonna get there soon enough. And then you would tweak this thing. Let me save this. The next steps will be to make this thing, this house, into, well, a house that looks more convincing. And if it's a tree house, it's probably not made out of concrete. So what we want to be doing is most likely something that consists out of wood. Because, I don't know, your mom or your dad have been working on this for ages, and you are a very non-spoiled little brat, and you appreciate their efforts because it's an amazing house. And that is exactly what we're aiming for. Amazing stuff. Let me maybe branch off one branch more from here, and then so it can support this house a bit better, because I think this would actually not work right now. Probably just tip over and then everyone would die in a horrible death. And if there's a way we can avoid that, that'd be nice. So maybe over here we just have another multi-cut edge loop. So those 4 will be, or maybe, well, I guess that should be okay. Again, twist as always, and lower this down. Maybe push it up a bit. Yeah, and then, oops, Control E, and offset. there, and then thickness, just, oops, of course, totally wrong, way too much. And then D for aligning it with the pivot. Sometimes the gizmo is actually in the way, and then you can just simply hit minus or plus to make the gizmo bigger or smaller, depending. So I'm already kind of annoyed by this house right now being in the way. So I'm just going to click on the tree itself and hit Control 1 to just isolate this thing. So our selection is still the current selection, so we don't even have to reselect these things. Okay, and then move this over here, rotate it, find something that could look okay. Just by hitting Control 1 again, you just make everything else visible. And then you can line this up. Like that. Extruding once again. Now this also feels a bit more like this could be an actual treehouse that would not just crumble immediately the moment people take their first steps into the house. That would be tragic. Unless you're making a horror movie, because then it's exactly the kind of thing you want to do. Yeah, this is not good topology because we're kind of bending things too much and pushing them out. Let's see what the sculpting tool can do for us. Is this even touching the thing? No, it's not even touching the plateau. Be sure that that happens. Also maybe this up a bit more. So make sure that this actually kind of lands at its destination, so it does support the weight and the structure to an extent at which we can be, well, give in to the suspense of disbelief. Soft. A bit more believable, as this is now supported by 2 branches, or essentially 1, but that has 2 sub-branches. Or 1, actually. Okay. Good enough. It wouldn't fall over now, I suppose. Save. Oh, I misclicked, but there's always 2 Maya windows, I think. Go to Maya. Oh no. Masterpiece 4. Cancel. What? Save change. Yeah, I guess so. Alright, yeah, I was in saving, so I misclicked, but it's still saved and I'm back. So press that Go to Maya button, which is also new. That's the thing. They always change things and you get used to old workflows and then you're like sometimes a bit baffled by how things work now. But the biggest features rarely change. Okay, that's okay. Max, just stop this. Stop doing the thing I always do. Spending way too much time on things that eventually might not matter all that much. Cool. So if you isolate this cube now, Control 1, we also see that there's this thing on the bottom that we will never see. Just bye-bye. And now we can start carving things out or into this. So it's pretty much up to us how we want to tackle this. First of all, I want to give this cube a bit more topology, but since we did so many things in between, the history of Maya does not allow us to do this. So I'm just going to get rid of all the history now. Edit by type history. Now we're just left with the basics. So just the house, like where it is, mesh, and the material. So if I select everything and say edit, delete all by type history, then every single mesh lost its history to time. So this thing, I can use the multicut tool maybe, and then just introduce some geometry like that. And one more over here, because this is going to be a wooden house. Doesn't even have to be precise. What happens if I It's all based on reference actually, so it really depends on how you want to do this. Maybe not like that. Let me first think. Maybe a cube is a bad idea to begin with. Let's do it a different way. So we're gonna introduce another cube though, but it's gonna do a different job now. And also I want to assign a different material to this because it's using the standard Lambert 1, and apparently I shouldn't have done that. Lambert 1 should always be the grayish thing that everything is using by default. So I'm just gonna select all of them and hit right click and say assign new material, and then make this into its own dedicated treetop mat. And then I'm gonna be making that thing green. And this thing is now back to, or still Lambert 1, and I'm just gonna make this gray. So all this, whenever I introduce a primitive, it's gonna be gray now, because everything is using Lambert 1, which is even, you can't even change the name, it's all grayed out. Just because models have to have some way of shading, otherwise you wouldn't be able to see them. So what I'm doing now is just playing around with this. So in order to get some wooden planks, then you just make this longer. And probably I'm going to be putting this pivot point, so D and then V. Only going to hit or select this y-axis, then just let go now and just snap to the face here, and now it's on the bottom. Now I can hit V to make this snap to the surface over here. So this could be the basis for everything. So if you build everything out of wooden planks, then this is the way to do it, I guess, or at least I think it could work. So shift right click for the multicut tool, and then if you hold down, you can introduce one more over here, one more here, maybe a third here. And now, because we introduced some vertices, let's make use of them to just give this, all of this, like a bit of like an imperfect look. So add imperfections so that it could be a bit more believable as being made out of wood. So wood is always a bit wonky in most cases, especially in a tree house. You would not expect perfect wood that is perfectly straight. Right, so as well, we would want to bevel this, very likely at least. So on the edges, I'm just going to select these edges here. And you know what? I'm just going to select these edges and hold on Shift, select those. Not those, because we don't want to bevel them, but including those. At this point, it's probably even smarter to select everything in vertex mode maybe. You can also convert your selection into other selections. So if you hold down Control, you can say two edges. So now your current selection, which is vertex mode, you can just say, make this into an edge selection. And just a tip, just a thing that exists. And if you shift select things that are currently already selected, and you do that again, it deselects them. So now everything is selected, but the thing you just deselected from it. And also those can go, make it a bit smaller by hitting minus, so it's not in the way. There's many ways to do this. This is one of them. And the rest I want to be beveled. So yeah, it's ready to be beveled. So shift, right click and bevel. Now everything gets this decent looking, well, softer edges, so to speak. If I rotate this, how does it look here on the bottom? That's fine. Might not even be necessary, but we'll see. So if I also give this a material, again, this is not necessary, but I just want to have some visual representation. I'm going to make this also brown, maybe a bit less saturated, maybe even darker, and call this wooden planks. And if we stick to a name, then stick to some name convention. Don't make things up all the time because it's just confusing. Then you could duplicate this and then maybe put the pivot here or the center and just rotate this. And if you might recall from the beginning where I mentioned that there's step snap. So if you hold down J, you can also see it now in the tool setting. It's step snapping to into 15-degree increments. So if I do that now, if I hold down J, then I can just do that, 15 degrees. Then V for pushing this down. I rotated this, holding down J. I'm just reusing the same thing, the same wooden plank. Maybe you want to make this a bit smaller. This is how you trick the human eye. And we have these nice gaps in between this. And then we can also Control D, duplicate this, move this over. And then this way you can have like somewhat imperfect looking wooden planks for the wooden house. If it's even a wooden house, you can make this anything. And every once in a while you want to rotate things so you break off this moment in which someone might be like, wait a sec, I see a pattern. So it's quite easy to break that impression. Control D. If you rotate now, I think all of them rotate individually because they do not share the same pivot. It's not combined. So if you want to add even more imperfections, just rotate them slightly. So here and there, just a bit. It goes a long way because it's imperfections. And then the brain is like, oh, that's all unique stuff. If it's still not enough, you can always come back to these vertices, just move them up. And here, maybe rotate this a bit. And this. Maybe this goes down a bit. So every time your brain might think like, oh, that's the same thing, you just break it off a bit. So it's like, no, it's all unique. It's all about faking details. Maybe over here and let this edge goes down a bit. You can also use soft select, but then again, there's not too much going on, so it might not be even worth using it. Or it might be. That's cool. So the rest is done through the texturing, that where you apply something that looks like wood, and then it's gonna be okay. This one can also have the same material. So if you already have a material, you can just come over to the surface, right-click it, and then say assign existing material, and then it lists all the materials there are in your scene. So I just created this before. So wooden planks, just let go, and then it shares the same material, so it uses the same color in this case. Hit save. Oops. So now you can also just select all of them and then combine them. So shift right-click and say combine. Now they have their own pivot point. You can just move it down. Maybe even snap it holding V at the same time. And now it's in the center here. Now I could duplicate this thing. Rotate it by holding down J. Rotate it in increments. Here maybe. I feel like I want to look at this thing from top without being in this so-called perspective mode. Then the easiest way to do that is probably hit spacebar. Just quickly, once, don't hold it, just hit it once. And then you are in all these different modes. They are called top-down view, perspective view, the one that we used so far, front view, and side view. And right now you don't see that much, but you can always just click into it and then hit F for focus. Then it would focus on the currently selected model, whatever the camera is seeing in general. And over here, if you click here, and you also can zoom in. So now you can work in either of these modes and focus only on one side. So that might actually be helpful. And if you want to go and essentially full screen one of these modes, you just click into them and hit spacebar again. Then it maximizes the view. And you cannot move the camera because it's an orthographic mode. So it's all static and, well, you can only pan around. If you want to go back to perspective, just go in here, click it, hit spacebar, and you're back into perspective. There's another fancy mode that I think Mark Stripper and we are using all the time, but it takes some getting used to. It's also a bit cluttered, but there's a quick way to switch and swap different perspective modes. So if you just keep spacebar pressed, it opens up this contextual menu, which is essentially all the menus you also find on top here at your fingertips. If you then, while holding it down, like the spacebar, you also left click this, then you also can quickly switch between the different camera modes. So perspective view, if you now let go over left view, now it's in left view. spacebar, click, left click, top, back, right, bottom, perspective, and so on. So that's a bit convoluted because you have a menu on top of a menu, so that might be a bit hard to read, but at some point you might be like, oh, perspective, oh, top-down view. Just click and drag, and then at some point you become so good at it, or not good at it, but efficient, let's put it that way, that you don't even mind or see anything. So this is, I think this is the top camera. So the moment you use these different angles, it might actually reveal that this is the thing now, like in your scene. So then you can just come over to the outliner. Right now you see everything is hidden, like all these cameras from all these angles, and this one just got, well, unhidden, and you just hide it by hitting H. Now we don't see it anymore. Still works, it's just invisible. I would just call this hashtag Maya things, just things you get used to. So if I'm happy with this, maybe one more, because we don't want to model for ages. We want to get results that are rather quick. And once more, rotate this. Maybe not even on this axis alone, but also by centering the pivot now, we can just come over to modify and say center pivot. And now you just rotate this on this axis as well. So just like that, to have a bit more variety. So your brain will pick this up subconsciously, and it's going to be like, yeah, that's similar looking planks, but never ever would anyone believe that it's all the same. It just looks too different. Same thing here. Holding down J for incremental rotation. Of course, it's a bit boring because I guess it's lacking a window. So for that kind of stuff, we'd have to dive a bit deeper. So first we have to separate this. So either mesh and then separate, or it's also where you find combine, or shift right click, separate, same thing. So now they're all individual elements again. And now you could essentially maybe, how will I? First I have to define how thick things should be. Let me get the mannequin. Or did I kill the person? I think it looks like I somehow... or is it still here somewhere? And these are all groups. I guess I lost something along the way. Well, the humanoid is gone, so I'm just going to get it back by coming over to the content browser, just double clicking it. Or it might have been in the center all along. Ground, human body. And hold on V to make it snap to here. Of course, it's probably a children's treehouse and not necessarily something that an adult will be taking a foot into. We'll see. Move this further here. So could it even access this room? I guess so. So it would hit its forehead while trying to step in, but that's fine. If it's for kids, then this should be okay. So if I rotate this reference here, oops, it's the wrong handle, this one. Just put it here just to determine how thick things should be. At least, I think, 3 planks. Yeah. So these 3 can go. Then you can duplicate this maybe. Pivot point is a bit weird there. Let's move this up. Okay, that's even more weird. I think I'm just going to introduce a new cube and then model this from scratch. So put this here, make it smaller, get roughly the same scale. Plus a few times because the gizmo is getting too small. Like that, so it has to be roughly the same scale. Otherwise it will kind of fall apart. The illusion, that is. And then we are going to push this a bit up So kids are probably want to be here when they have a sightseeing tour when it comes to their surroundings here, looking out the window. And also going to introduce a bit more. Oops, not that person. So you may go now, for now. And then these vertices, we're just going to rotate them. So maybe make it a bit more bulky. This one goes here. Hit minus, so the pivot is a bit less fat. And then we need all these edges to be beveled. Or essentially just select everything and then select the centers to take that away from the selection. It's much faster. And then you would bevel this. So shift right click. Now you beveled this and it looks more believable. And then I'm happy, almost, because I want to assign the same material to this so it looks brown. And again, I can only repeat myself. This is not necessary, but it makes it a bit more enjoyable to model. Here. And one more. I think all of them are a bit too thick, so just trim them down a bit here. If I move the pivot here and I rotate this further there and then down, holding down V, maybe a bit more. Kind of has to intersect, so these things cannot really float unless they have been assembled that way somehow. And once you're happy with this, because I think I am, you can just duplicate this and move this up. And then I would not just squash things, because then you're also squashing the beveling. So I would just move those two up manually. Maybe those two. This one is its own thing, apparently. And you also move this up. And one of them can probably be a bit longer or shorter, or maybe you play around with the randomness here a bit more to make it more believable. Now we are getting some sort of impression that this has been man-made and no one was aiming for perfection, including us. So that's a window. And for now, I'm just going to leave it at that, and I'm going to see you in part 2 of this endeavor. See you there.